Welcome everyone. I'm Simon Stevens. I'm the head of publications events at the Museums Association. I'd like to welcome you all to this meeting for MA members in the southwest of England. We're delighted that you can join us. It is obviously Super Thursday, so I guess a lot of you have been voting. There's votes all over the UK, including the southwest. I'm chairing today's event, and I have my colleague Rebecca Atkinson working in the background to make sure that everything runs smoothly. This is the first of our new look MA members meetings, so do bear with us if there are any tech problems. We're now running these events as Zoom meetings rather than Zoom webinars, as we want to make them more interactive, and Zoom meetings means we can use the breakout rooms and attendees are able to speak as well, unlike in the webinar format. So this session is being recorded and will be on the MA website soon for those that couldn't make it today. A reminder that these meetings are free to all MA individual members, corporate members, and those who work for institutions that are members. The timetable is online, so you should have seen that, and after this I'll try and paste it into the chat as well. You will hopefully have all read the joining instructions document we sent about getting the best out of the meeting, but just in case you missed anything, here are a few bits of advice before we start. You should all be muted automatically, but if not, please mute yourselves. Feel free to have your videos on and off, whatever suits you. You're invited to ask questions using the chat function, which is on the option menu bar. If possible, obviously, please include your name and job title and institution in your questions. You can also use the chat function to respond to the issues raised and to chat with other attendees. And you can leave and rejoin the meeting anytime. We do have a hashtag for today. That's MA Southwest England. So before we start, a quick reminder that our next online event takes place on the 20th of May. This is a one-day conference looking at how museums can become more inclusive. After that, we have museums and Black Lives Still Matter on the 2nd of June. This is a free event for members and non-members of the MA, and it's a joint UK and US symposium that will look at how museums are responding to racism and what needs to happen next. More details and information on how to book are available on the MA website, which also includes details of our annual conference, which is on the 8th to the 10th of November. And this year is going to be an in-person and online event. The theme this year is Brave New World, and there'll be more information about the programme soon, but it is open for bookings. One other thing to note is that we were going to end the event today with some online networking led by our two MA reps for the Southwest, Chloe and Abby, but for different reasons, neither of them can be here, sadly. So instead, we could just extend the panel discussion we have at the end of the day, and there will be more time for your thoughts as well. So now, with all that out of the way, I'll hand over to our first speaker. I'm really delighted to introduce Gillian Finlay. Gillian is the Cultural Venues Manager at Museums and Galleries Edinburgh, but she is also the President of the Museums Association. Gillian recently took over from Maggie Appleton, and I think I'm right in saying this is her first public engagement as our President. So, a big welcome to Gillian.
Thank you, Simon. It's actually my second public engagement now, but I'm not gonna split hairs about it. And can I just say as well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here with all of you today. I was looking briefly just now at the list of names appearing. I only know a couple of you, so this is just an amazing opportunity for me, albeit we're still online for now, but a great opportunity to start to get to know more of my fellow MA members, to learn more about your museums, and to learn and understand more about sector priorities in the Southwest. So I'm thrilled to be here today. I hoped it might be useful if I kicked off with explaining very briefly, I promise, just a little bit about the path that led me to being here with you today. So I've been a member myself, an MA member myself, for I think about 25 years now. I've been a trustee of the Museums Association for about 4, but as Simon's just explained, I've only been the president for just over a month. So it's still a very new role to me, taking over from Maggie. It's still a role that I'm making my own. And it's a huge privilege and very, very exciting. It's the latest, though, in a number of different roles that I've had with museums that I've been fortunate enough to have an experience in my career. I know I won't be alone when I say I started off as a volunteer, actually at the Museum of Childhood in Edinburgh, which some of you may know, and working 3 other jobs at the time in order to make that experience possible, including weekends with the learning team at the new National Museum of Scotland as it was then, before securing my first full-time post with Tyne and Weir museums on a fixed term community collecting project. And jobs followed from there with a small borough council museum in Cumbria, and then with many years as part of the museum development team at Museums and Galleries Scotland, which was a joy. It took me all over the country, up to the Highlands and the Islands, and working with museums large and small across the nation. And I mention that in particular because those experiences, the early career experiences, are the ones that really crystallized for me, I think, an awareness of just how often museums play a central role in communities' sense of place, and the importance of advocating for them and for funding as culture and public finances more widely have become just ever tighter. More recently, I've worked for a couple of years with the Alio Culture, Perth and Kinross, managing the museum and archive provision in that region. But the rest of my career has been absolutely as a very proud public servant with Museums and Galleries Edinburgh, where I started, it must be about 10 years ago now, as Senior Curator of History, and then became Curatorial and Engagement Manager. And now I'm acting Head of Service, which is my dream job in the most incredible city that I'm lucky to call home. And as Simon has indicated today, it's a city bursting with anticipation as people head through the snow, I have to say, to the polls, and parliamentary elections, where once again, the focus here is on whether Scotland's future will be as an independent nation or remaining as part of the United Kingdom. As some of you will be aware, will have experienced, one of the most interesting, if that's the word, aspects of working for a local authority museum service is that you're so often impacted by and sometimes directly involved with delivering wider council objectives. So this week, for example, some of my team are involved in supporting the election. They've been counting postal votes, and through tonight, they'll also be counting physical ballots. And over the last month, tens of others, members of staff, have returned from furlough to train and to help staff the pop-up COVID testing centres that are being set up at our branch libraries across Edinburgh, as like so many other places, we start to turn our attention towards a recovery programme out of the pandemic experience. In light of COVID and the financial pressures that local government across the UK continues to experience, I'm sure my employer isn't alone in also finding it necessary to publish a completely new business plan, articulating very clearly and very simply, in fact, just three objectives, three priorities that it considers absolutely core in its mission to best serve local communities and local people. It's not often I'm excited by a business plan, but I find this one, I don't mind admitting, an absolute doozy, aligning completely as it does, certainly for the first time that I can remember, with my own values and focusing, like my own museum service, very much on inclusive practice and social outcomes, and happily chiming too with a number of the MA's current strategic objectives. So the first shared priority that I wanted to mention today is around addressing the climate emergency. Edinburgh aims to become a carbon neutral city within 15 years. So it's a theme, it's a subject that's important to my workplace, to me personally, and we know the MA is also looking at embedding sustainable practice across the museum sector and for all of our organisations. It's a priority that speaks, I think, to many of us because it's about enhancing and extending a lot of the practice we already have, championing and supporting and working with local partners and local communities, with families and individuals to engage urgently in discourse and action to make the changes to the way that we live and behave that are so necessary if we're going to arrest the damage being done to our planet and nurture a kinder, more thoughtful and resourceful society along the way. And that theme links with, I think, the second priority, which is about addressing inequality. For Edinburgh, again, this begins and ends with the highly ambitious target to eradicate poverty and homelessness by 2030. But on that path intersects with other objectives to end discrimination and injustice in all of its forms. And that fight for a fairer, more equitable society and a more diverse and representative sector clearly echoes with the work of the Museums Association. And to me, I'm, like I'm sure many of you here today, a huge supporter and believer in the Museums Change Lives campaign. And I'm really looking forward to, as president, to continuing the MA's work and advocating for the inclusive and the impactful vision that it represents, as well as the other campaigns that we lead, from decolonisation to calling out workplace inequity. Last, but certainly not least, there's a third shared priority, the one that I really want to focus on today, and that's around enhancing and nurturing well-being. There are many definitions, I think, of well-being, what it means, but one of the most commonly cited is the World Health Organization, which defines it as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And we know that museums and other cultural organisations have long been involved in delivering against that agenda. The many benefits to community, to individual visitors and event participants or volunteers in museums are well documented. Recently, there's been these have been articulated very clearly, I think, with the new evidence in the report by the National Alliance for Museums, Health and Wellbeing, titled Museums for Health and Wellbeing, and which I'd recommend. It highlights that even while often tagged primarily as learning, engagement or outreach work, aims regularly focused on include wellbeing aims and initiatives, such as providing meaningful or creative ways for people to participate in or to direct museum activity, to learn new skills, to volunteer or otherwise take part in good work with purpose, to ease social isolation or exclusion, to confirm a sense of belonging, and to celebrate individual or community identity, culture or heritage, to make people feel more positive, more hopeful, more connected, happier. And these core activities, these core outcomes are in museums are ones which many of you will be aware of or are involved in delivering directly in your own museums. And of course, they're crucial for community well-being. And during this lockdown, I think our sector has been incredibly inventive and resourceful in finding ways to continue this work when it's needed the most, despite the challenges of restricted movement and the ability to connect in person. But that's not my starting point with well-being today. You are actually my starting point, my concern with well-being as people, fellow humans, as members of the UK Museums workforce, and of course as MA members. On an individual level, our experience of the pandemic and lockdown has naturally depended very much on our personal circumstances, whether we've been alone, unable to see family or friends, or in a bubble with loved ones, whether any of us have been ill ourselves or have family or friends or colleagues who have become ill, whether we've been able to work, what our experience of working from home has been, if we have been able to work or if we've been working on site for various reasons. And of course, if we haven't been able to work, our experience of being furloughed or even of being made unemployed. And significant personal uncertainty remains ahead, despite the good progress in our 4 nations, at least, with a vaccination rollout. For those returning now or considering returning to the workplace as restrictions start to ease, there are concerns too about what's changed, what's going to be different, about how safe we'll be, about the long-term impact of the pandemic on our job security. And those are concerns that are very real. If our roles and expectations about how we work have changed during lockdown, what will that mean longer term? For those who may have lost their jobs, and we know there are over 4,000 redundancies so far in our sector alone, the stress of whether finding work will be even possible during the recovery period, and whether domestic household income is secure or whether real financial difficulty is now being felt, And all the anxiety and the emotional turmoil that that brings is inescapable. So personal well-being, I believe at the moment, for many of us, for many reasons, is absolutely key. And in a number of ways, it directly links to organizational well-being. For museums everywhere, there's a clear desire and a need to be able to plan now, to be able to forecast so that they can support their business, their teams, their users, their visitors and communities in the weeks and months ahead, meaning some pretty complex scenario planning. But financial uncertainty, of course, is rife and remains rife. Even when restrictions are eased, as we're seeing currently here in Scotland, some museums are not reopening. They won't reopen. It's simply not viable to reopen. Or if they are reopening, it's only partially this year. With some sites and some services suspended either temporarily or permanently. Few have been able to make any income over the last year, so crucial for so many, of course. And for those even in receipt of government funding, new priorities may be emerging as part of local recovery planning, bringing challenge as well as hope and opportunity. With international tourism unlikely to recover for several years and a new or renewed focus on local and domestic audiences, museums must adapt and must understand the needs and interests of that demographic, engaging in a very different context than they were even just over a year ago. Their organizational health depends upon it. And that, of course, impacts more broadly and strategically on the well-being of the wider sector. And I believe the MA, along with other sector support bodies and funders around the UK, has a responsibility here too, to consider how we can support sector well-being and resilience that in this much changed and challenging environment. We saw how quickly and how radically targeted advocacy and action achieved results, the revised funding streams, the online guidance and support that was made available when lockdown was first introduced and our museums across the UK closed en masse. And as leaders, enablers, standard holders, and influencers, I think we need to ask ourselves what we've learned, how effectively we've been able to act, how our own practice and priorities has changed over the last year as a result, and how the best of that learning can be developed and sustained into the future. And your input to that discussion is going to be key as individuals and museum volunteers and employees, as MA members, as members and subscribers to other sector supports. It's you that has the experience, the knowledge and the ideas that can shape how we work, how we build back better together from this point, and how we ensure that wellness, personal, organisational and sector health can be prioritised and strengthened. So my ask of you today is please do feel free to share your thoughts and your experiences about this today. And please, after today, keep us at the MA in touch with what wellness looks like and feels like for you, for your museum and for your community. Tell us what has changed or what needs to change in your neighbourhood and your museum to ensure that recovery leaves nobody behind. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gillian. That was fantastic. Really, really important issue and yeah, brilliantly described. So we're going to move into sort of breakout groups soon where we can discuss lots of issues, including well-being. So putting people in groups and having chats is one of the things we wanted to do with these meetings. So and we wanted to look at Museums Change Lives as well, which is really obviously our key flagship campaign. We often feature MCL case studies on our website and our events and in Museums Journal. So we'll be in sort of groups of 5 or 6, and if you could start off by introducing yourself to each other, that would be great. So it'd be fantastic if you could share some examples of work you're aware of that's having a fantastic impact on communities by enhancing people's health and well-being, inspiring engagement, debate and reflection, and the third plank of MCL, which is creating better places to live and work. So if each group could identify maybe 1 or 2 projects to share with everyone when we come back together, that'd be fantastic. It might be an idea to nominate someone to feedback. So we can't allocate specific people to specific rooms, but just by the law of averages, there's likely to be an MA staff member in each room, and if not, we'll move somebody about. So, Rebecca, if you could start that process of putting people into different rooms, that would be fantastic. I think I can pop into rooms as well and see how you're getting on as well. So we'll be about 10 minutes in each of the rooms, and then we'll bring everyone back together. So yeah, identifying MCL work in the museum we work with, or work you're aware of, would be fantastic, and then that'd be really good. So I think Rebecca's doing this.
Oh, yeah, I'm going to open the rooms now, Sam. I'm just waiting for you to
go.
You ready?
How can I tell when everyone's back? So I guess.
I think everyone's back.
Right. Brilliant. Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. I hope that worked for everyone and was enjoyable and fun, and you had some good chats. I was in a small group with Alistair, our policy manager, and Joanna Bellis from the RNLI Heritage Department. It was really interesting. We talked a bit about the various stuff that RNLI does, including Grace Darling Museum in Northumberland, which has definitely got some fantastic impact on its communities and more widely for the work it does, from that amazing story about Grace Darling. So does anyone else have any work they'd like to share? I can't see everyone, so you might just have to start talking if that's okay.
If nobody's going to jump in, I will. There were some absolutely brilliant examples in my breakout room. So Stephen from Givor gave the example of the online exhibition that they did about the Bell Maidens, I think it was, the women in mining, which sounded brilliant. And also Dartmoor Prison Museum, two initiatives, one putting on an online tour and taking that into care homes and keeping the connection alive with that community there, and then working with Arts Lab, who works with prisoners to produce art and poetry during the lockdown, and then creating a film of that, which will be one of the opening exhibitions. And then this, all genius, but this is fantastic, St Ives, who instead of doing a book group, do a look group. So they've got groups dotted all over Cornwall who, discuss art and exhibitions and the collections of Tate St Ives, and they've been able to carry on doing that online. So 3 brilliant examples. Apologies to the people who didn't hear from, but do stick stuff in the chat and we'll capture it that way.
That's brilliant, Sharon. That sounds fantastic, chat. Is there any other groups? How many groups were there? Is there any from another group? Can't see anyone, so
Tamsin wants to.
Tamsin.
Just briefly, so it's just always interesting, isn't it, when we get into different groups, because we focus on something really different. So we just introduced where everybody was, and so we reflected, I suppose, a little bit on our wellness journey, and also just a little bit on the challenges. And so some of the things that resonated with everybody was around this pivoting to digital, and specifically potentially digital capability. We also talked about the interaction between doing that, but the additional challenge of formal learning, where schools were also closed as well as institutions, and that made it more problematic. We sort of talked about that. We talked about the fact that we've come out of a winter and the weather's still not great. It is, hailing and snowing in Scotland, and we're all just perhaps feeling a little bit tired as well. So that, combined with the urgency to open, is quite draining. And then something else that we talked about, which was really great, was just about well, not great, but just interesting, that we need to remember is, the rural context in terms of the Southwest, in terms of where museums are located. And obviously there are some big hitting cities and towns, but equally there are lots of smaller museums that are working in very small communities that may well have their own very particular priorities that don't necessarily always resonate with the museum priorities. So yeah, it was a really lovely conversation. So thank you so much.
And thanks, Tamsin. That sounded really interesting as well. So anyone else before we move on to our next speaker?
I can do one very quickly for our little group.
Brilliant.
I don't think we covered half as much as everybody else. We introduced ourselves and we said the similarities between Scotland and Southwest, because some of us feel wonderful now because we can talk to you guys and we can interact more with Museums Association. Yay. And I feel that there's some really good positive things from our group, people who are planning moves and being positive and trying to engage more with our community. So I think a couple of people said that. And then there was also that sort of concern that we, like Tamsin said, we've been through a lot and we're still going through a lot, and we need support both within our organisations and from without. It's that thing of put your mask on almost first in the plane, and then you can help other people. I think that sort of sums up what we were talking about.
Brilliant. Thanks for sharing that, Rachel. That's really interesting. Yeah, support's definitely really important right now, isn't it? Across the board. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks everyone so much for sharing, and do carry on sharing in the chat. I think now I'm going to hand over to our next speaker, who's Sharon, who you've just heard from. Sharon's the director of the Museums Association, and Sharon is going to actually be discussing how the MA has been supporting our members and the wider sector with our advocacy funding and lots more over the past 12 months and looking forward as well. So over to you, Sharon.
Thanks very much, Simon. And as I said, brilliant chat in that breakout. Really loved it, actually. And I'm sort of got a running list of museums that I really want to visit as soon as we can get back out there. And it's kind of chopping and changing. I'm definitely coming down to the Southwest for an extended visit. Obviously, won't do it at peak time when all the other people are trying to get there. But really keen to get out and about again and see museums. So I guess thinking about our sector and our priorities, the question we've all been asking is exactly the one that Gillian put at the beginning. What have we learned and what does this mean for the future? So I was actually hoping that people could, on that wellness and well-being topic, do a little exercise just at the beginning while I'm talking, while I'm sharing slides, and think about how we're feeling. Just one word that sums up where you're at in the pandemic. It's proved to be a bit of a roller coaster, or a corona coaster, as it has been named. You know, we all have up days and down days. Wellbeing is really, really important. Today, I'm feeling optimistic. There is blue sky out there. The European Museum of the Year Awards are on later tonight. We're going to get to see some fabulous European museums winning prizes. And I'm in this meeting with members, which is absolutely fabulous. But I know not everybody might be feeling the same. So if you could just stick in chat how you're feeling, I think it just helps to share. At the Museums Association, like a lot of museums, we had to make some swift and sometimes difficult decisions as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown. We were very fortunate that all our staff could work from home straight away. And I think one of the things that is really useful to think about, which Jill touched on as well, is how we're recalibrating the world of work and reprioritising for us and for our careers and for our museums. And sort of thinking, it doesn't have to be like it was before. We don't have to go back to the old normal. We could use this as an opportunity to support a better work-life balance, to support our well-being. But we also know that lots of institutions didn't have the kind of setup that they needed for everybody to work at home straight away, and many staff are not able to work from home, and lots of us have had to face tough decisions and an uncertain future, and many of us are returning to work with mixed feelings, with nervousness, maybe carrying grief. I talked to some members in Scotland recently who were talking about the loss of colleagues and volunteers during this pandemic. The only certainty is uncertainty. And I think we have to seriously address the question of equity, that our front of house colleagues may not be able to work from home and might not have that equity in the return to work and the work-life balance. So I think we just need to think and reflect really carefully on where we're at and how we rethink the world of work and rethink our museums. Part of us doing that at the Museums Association was going straight back to our mission, our vision and our values. Our mission is inspiring museums to change lives. Our vision is around inclusive and participatory and sustainable museums at the heart of their communities. And our values are centred around inclusivity, diversity and equality. And so we went back to that mission, vision and values and then thought about what it means for us in the middle of a global pandemic when everybody in society is wondering how we're going to cope. And we decided our priorities for the Museums Association were staff welfare, business continuity, looking after our members and supporting our members and supporting the wider sector. And that really did for us mean that we were able to carry on supporting our members, but also tailor our offer, our emergency response to what you were telling us that you needed. We realised to begin with, actually, we can't do anything without our people. And by our people, I mean our staff, our volunteers. So I know there are lots of people in the virtual room who support the AMA as reviewers and as mentors. And I know there are FMAs as well in the room, those that support that process. If you don't understand those acronyms, then please do look on our website under careers and professional development, but it's our main professional development offer. And there were lots of you that took part in that either as mentees or as mentors. And that really showed to me the collegiate sense of community that there is in the sector, that people really do want to support and look after each other when challenges come up. Obviously, we have to ensure business continuity, because if we can't carry on as a Museums Association, then we can't carry on supporting you. And unfortunately, we did have to restructure our organisation. We had to tailor our business to recognise what was happening in society and the sector. We lost 2 posts and they were very valued members of staff, but I wanted to be upfront about that because we tried to do it on the basis of being as supportive and transparent as we could, and in consultation with staff and our recognised trade union. But we're going through exactly what the sector's going through. We know it's hard for individuals and staff, and we know these discussions are taking place in many museums. We've clocked 4,000 plus redundancies on our redundancy tracker, and we're analysing those results now. So please do feed in to that online if you hear of any more examples. But also, as I say, we've been really supporting our members with our emergency offer. And I won't go into too much details about that in terms of workforce, because I know Tamsin is going to speak soon, and she's done an absolutely brilliant job of tailoring our offer to support members' needs over the course of the last 13 months. The other thing I would say is, and this is just coincidental, this is on my, I say desk, it's my kitchen table, this book by Hilary McGowan and Piotr, which is about managing change in museums and galleries, is a really great new addition to the books and the resources that we can go back to as a sector. And that really talks about that process of managing change that we've all had to go through. Hilary's not given me a backhand for that. It just happened to be sitting here and I saw that she'd joined the meeting, and it's a really useful addition to that support that we have in the sector. But the thing that we've been thinking about is the idea of cultural recovery with museums at its heart. And by that, we mean 3 things. We mean museums being able to bring people back into towns and to cities and to villages and to rebuild community confidence. Museums that can support community recovery and well-being, and museums that can help us understand the events of the past year, the kind of madness that's happened, and help us to plan for a better future. And so that's the sort of central focus of our advocacy at the moment. We really want to make sure that we have a cultural and community-led recovery for everyone, but that museums are at the heart of that. So to make that case, to do that advocacy, we've been working sector-wide across all 4 nations of the UK with governments and administrations, and really working with other sector organisations such as the Association of Independent Museums and the National Museum Directors Council and others to make the strongest possible case for funding, because obviously that is crucial, but also for the value of museums, and to say we need our museums, society needs museums if we're going to recover well. So we've done a range of advocacy at a national and a regional level to make sure that argument is heard. We've published a Welsh version of Museums Change Lives recently. We did manifestos in Scotland and in Wales in the run-up to the elections today. And we'll also be updating our advocacy resources so that we can support you to make the case at a local level. One thing I will just add for now is we worked with Crowdfunder and are working with Crowdfunder as well on the Support Our Museums campaign, which has raised £285,000 so far for a range of museums. You can join that site and you can get ahead with crowdfunding. Contact staff at the Museums Association if you want to know more. Look up Support Our Museums. There's a button there that says Start Fundraising, so that's for the people who want to fundraise. There's a whole page underneath if you want to donate. And it's just a really simple way of getting that message out there that our museums need support, and you as a member of the public can help to do that. Obviously, COVID is not the only thing that's happened in the last 14 months, much as it might feel like it is. Then there was also, we're coming up to the anniversary of the death of George Floyd and the activism and campaigns that happened as a result of that. And museums across the UK, I think, responded really well with statements and actions that they were going to do. There's a fantastic analysis actually in Museums Journal this month, which is just out, looking at what museums not just said they do, but actually did as well. And I think it's that question that we need to keep going back to, what are we doing as individuals and institutions to ensure that racism is taken seriously and that we're fighting for equality and turning those words into action. So we're providing resources and support for museums. And as Simon said, we have an event on the 2nd of June at 6 p.m. with Culture And, which will be a transatlantic conversation with our colleagues in America about what more museums can do. And I think there is a clear link between our collections and the conversation about the legacy and impacts of empire and slavery in society and in our museums. And that conversation has not by any means gone away. So as the Museums Association, we convened and we are supporting the Decolonisation Guidance Working Group. That was one of the outcomes of our Empowering Collections report in 2019. And that really showed that museum workers want to do this work. And none of it is about cancelling or narrowing or wiping out. It's all about broadening and deepening our understanding of the impact of slavery and empire in our collections and in our institutions. So we'll be publishing resources on our website, and we've already got quite a lot of resources there under the campaign section, and there'll be more to come. And we're advocating as well for funding for this area of work. Gillian mentioned the climate crisis, and we're acutely aware that despite the fact that nobody's flying anywhere at the moment, this is still a critical issue. And especially with the focus that's going to be towards the end of the year with COP26 in Glasgow, we need as museums to take action, but also as the Museums Association to support that activity. So we will support museums to act practically with our communities to ensure that focus doesn't go away. And it's twofold really, isn't it? It's the things that we can do in the museum to make the institution itself greener, because we know that museums are a little energy hungry sometimes, but also it's the things that we can do with our collections and working with our communities to make sure that change ripples out into society. And I think museums are really uniquely positioned to have those conversations. So we'll be producing new web resources on the climate crisis and prioritising sustainability and action in this area over the course of the next couple of years. We've just done that little Museums Change Lives exercise, and I think it is possibly more relevant than it has been previously, with its themes around enhancing health and well-being, creating better places for us all to live and work. That sense of place has been so dislocated over the course of the last year that it would be really great to bring people back into communal spaces, into our museums, into their grounds, and to then use that opportunity to allow people the space and the time to reflect on some of the difficult, challenging things that have happened over the last year, but also think about what next and what kind of future do we want to build together. And I think that's really important. And then one of our big other areas of work has been our work around our learning and engagement manifesto, which we published last year. So we were in that work over the course of 12 to 15 months, consulted at least 1,000 people in the sector and beyond who work in learning and engagement, and came up with this 8-point manifesto, which is all on our website with the associated resources and also with case studies. And we've got a couple of webinars coming up around it as well. But it's on these 8 simple points: cultural rights and cultural democracy, which is recognising access and participation in culture as a basic human right. And I think that's really important because there are lots of human rights that have been challenged during the course of the last 12 months, but our access to culture is a really fundamental one. And then the question of social justice, which is thinking about museums having a responsibility to work with our communities to overcome some of the challenges that we've seen, including poverty. And I think museums have done a brilliant job on that. If you just understand how museums have thought around the digital divide and connecting to communities and families that might not have access to digital, then there's some brilliant examples of that. The idea of activism, which just starts from the position that museums are not neutral, and that our activism and our desire for change and to seek change should be based on listening to and acting with and delivering with our communities. Community participation, which is about developing new innovative models of engagement with our communities. Collections that are based on public use. I think there's been a really interesting thing that's happened over the last 12 months. The majority of museums have been shut for the majority of the time. So collections are held behind closed doors. And what we've tried to do as a sector is really re-establish that connection in many different ways, including digital, between the communities, our publics, our audiences, and that collection, because otherwise they're just kind of held away from society and everybody. And what we need is that connection and those stories to be developed and those narratives to be explored with our collections. Research and evaluation, I think, is really important. It's really important that we have good, rigorous research around our collections and all of the work that we do. And I think we were thinking about people-centered research as well, and that responds to those needs in society. How do we, and we have, use our collections to understand how to better combat the implications of the pandemic? How do we use our collections to and the research around them to understand how to respond? There's been really fantastic examples of that from medical and social history museums and collections over the course of the last 12 months. And then partnership, I think, part of the cultural recovery has to be museums working in partnership with other third sector organisations and charities and the business sector and local elected politicians and other stakeholders. We have to now more than ever work in partnership. And what we're saying really at this point is about bringing communities together and having those partnerships based on equality, and actually not with the usual suspects either, reaching out and branching out to other potential partners. And the last point of the manifesto is around workforce, because we need you, our members, and the people who work in and with museums to be able to make those connections between collections and communities. And it's really critical that we do that, but it's also critical that we have a workforce that is respected and rewarded equally, and that delivers and supports that critical work that we need to do post-pandemic. And the last couple of slides we'll have, one is on ethics, because we live in a time when there have been huge challenges, and I think the Code of Ethics has supported some of our responses to that, and is part of our values system in the sector. COVID-19 and other things that have happened in the last year have raised really interesting challenges for us, and the Code of Ethics has proved really invaluable in responding to that. So disposal by sale is and will continue to be a very real issue, and one that we're working with other sector organisations on to update responses on that. We've produced guidance on contemporary collecting in COVID, which of course everybody wants to collect, from the stickers that you see in your local shop to the vaccines themselves, which have been collected by museums, but it has to be done sensitively at a time when people, many hundreds of thousands of people, are grieving or really suffering huge impacts because of the pandemic. We've also responded to the ministerial letter to arm's length bodies about the retain and explain policy in England, using 1.2 of the code which is around ensuring editorial integrity, and also more recently responded to the non-reappointment of a trustee at Royal Museums Greenwich under the 1.3 of the code supporting freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And we really want to enter into an open dialogue with government and others around the ethics in the sector. I think it can really guide our everyday practice and is part of our values system. My last point on support that we give to the sector is around funding. So again, if you go to our website on our funding page, then there are lots of opportunities for the sector to take part in our distributed funding. So at a top line level, we're advocating obviously for recovery funding with other sector organisations, but we also distribute the Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund, and we tailored that over the last 12 months to respond to the pandemic. We developed a new fund with UKRI and AHRC, the Digital Innovation and Engagement Fund, again, a response to what was happening in the sector, and we're hopeful that there'll be further rounds of that. And we have the Beecroft bequest, which supports acquisitions of pre-19th century works of art, and the Benevolent Fund, which is supporting CPD and supports through our COVID support schemes members who are suffering hardship. So look all of those up, make sure other people know about them in the region, and if you come across people that are struggling, then do encourage them to look at those funds. And my last point is just on the future. So this image is from the Thackeray Museum of Medicine, which is in Leeds. I'm a trustee, disclaimer, I'm a trustee of that museum, and that museum during the pandemic became one of the first vaccination centres outside of a medical NHS setting, and that I thought was a fantastic role for that museum. And it's a museum that has undergone a big capital transformation and not been able to open since September last year when it was planned to open, and it really now is wanting to welcome people back in on the 17th of May as soon as it possibly can do. So hopefully the future is looking brighter for us and for museums. Museums are reopening, but the future is you. The future is the people in the sector. If people make museums, then you are the ones that will be delivering, partnering, sharing, learning, leading museums over the course of the next 5 years. And I would sort of ask people to think about three things. Rethink the value and the relevance of museums. Like, how are we valuable and relevant to our local communities? Let's try and democratise our institutions through public engagement. We don't have all the ideas, we don't have all the knowledge. Bring people in and get them engaged, and let's build our skills so that we can support our communities during that cultural recovery and really be at the heart of that cultural recovery. So that's all I've got to say. I'm going to hand back to Simon now. Very happy to take questions, really happy for people to drop me a line or put something in the chat if you've got thoughts.
Thanks so much, Sharon. That was fantastic. Brilliant whistle-stop tour of lots of all things MA. Does anyone have any questions for Sharon before we move on? As she said, she's happy to answer questions. I can't see anything at the moment, so if not, we'll carry on. I mean, do carry on using the chat as well. The chat has been brilliant. People sharing ideas and links and thoughts. It's been really great. So do carry on using that, and I'm sure Sharon can respond to questions in that as well if you post things there. So Sharon already mentioned the brilliant work being done over the past 12 months and longer by Tamsin Russell, our Workforce Development Officer. So next up, we have Tamsin. So Tamsin, handing over to you.
Hi, thank you very much, Simon, Sharon and Gillian and everyone in the audience. It's nice to see so many familiar faces. What I have got is a presentation, which I will share with you as well if you want a copy. But I'm really conscious that we've been listening for quite a bit of time and you've been listening to us all talk about, and so I'm going to put in a little tiny bit of reflection. But let me just tell you what we're going to do in the time that we have together. We've got 20 minutes, so I'm conscious of using our time really effectively today. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the support that we can offer to improve confidence and competence so that you can deliver and change lives using your collections for your communities. I've got 4 sections really. So I want you to start thinking about identifying your professional development needs. And that's what I'm going to get you to focus on now. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes to start thinking about your professional development needs. I'm going to put some prompts on my next slide. But equally, if you think that's just all too much, just think about what questions you might want to ask me, because in a way, that's also a way of identifying what you might want or need. So it's 15:03. These are the questions I'd like you to reflect on. This is called a silent reflection time. So just look at those questions, write some notes to the side, and I'll bring you all back with no requirement for feedback in a couple of minutes. So over to you, reflection time. See you in 2 to 3 minutes. Think about where you think you are. Maybe reflect on, have people given you feedback at all over the last year about areas you might want to focus on? Are there priorities for your organisation that you perhaps don't feel as comfortable or confident talking about or participating in? Or are there just questions you want to ask us about what we can offer? Have 2 minutes. You've got another minute to go, and then I'll carry on with my presentation. Thirty-second warning, then we'll come back. We're on, we're back in the zone. So what I don't want you to do is carry on as I'm thinking and talking about these questions. So this really is your ring fence time of 20 minutes for you to start thinking about what your professional development needs are. And what I'm going to talk about is what the Museums Association's professional development offer is, but also talk about our workforce commitment. So I'm just going to continue with my slides, hopefully. So just in terms of our offer, really just want to get across that there is something for everybody. So wherever you are in terms of an employee, a freelancer, a volunteer, we have programs that have been designed to enable you to participate and in whatever way, shape or form you need to do that. And the same goes in terms of career stage. So whether you're looking to get into the sector, or whether you're an early career, mid-career, whether you're more established like myself, I've worked in the sector now for 20 years. Again, we have opportunities that enable you to continue your development, because something that we know, and certainly is far more focused, I suppose, in the last 12 months, is our sector doesn't sleep. It's a hugely dynamic sector, and therefore to be able to continue to contribute in that, we need to keep around learning on an ongoing basis. Now, you might be in front of house, you might be in curatorial, you might be in learning. Again, we do have particular opportunities that talk specifically to individual functions and disciplines. So it could be that you're not in one of those individual functions or disciplines at the moment, but you have aspirations to go into those. So again, we have particular dedicated content. For example, one of our Museums Essentials programs all around working with collections that may well either work to act as a refresher for you or as a starting point if that's the area you want to go into. From example of roles, regardless of where you are in the hierarchy, there are things that can help you. So please make sure that you utilise, whether it be our early sort of career conversations or whether it's our fellowship. And again, I'll talk about all of that shortly. My role is really interesting. So I have to balance the needs of our members, that's you guys here at a members meeting, but also the sector as a whole. So what you'll see with a lot of our professional development programs and our workforce commitment is there'll be stuff that's open source, the sector as a whole, and then stuff that is very much ring fenced, either as a membership benefit or as a specific product. So just as a way of talking through it, we have, I suppose, 6 clear elements around the professional development content that sits within workforce and the MA. So we have 2 standalone events. So that's Don't Stop Me Now and Moving On Up, which will focus specifically around the changes within the sector, but very much from a career perspective. It's around enticing people in and also then helping them progress, which is why Don't Stop Me Now is the starting point. We then have Museums Essentials, which I'll talk about in a moment. The Associateship, which is one of the longest running and one of our biggest professional development programs. We have roughly about 300 people signed up to our AMA program. Mentoring is also part of not only the AMA, but also our commitment to a whole raft of different one-to-one development interventions. And that's also something you might want to think about, is do you best learn on a one-to-one situation? Do you best learn by yourself? Because depending on your learning preference, depends on which one of these particular products or opportunities may work best for you. So let's talk about Museum Essentials. So this has now been in place since October 2019, and it is your opportunity to work by yourself with signposted content and exercises to develop expertise in a particular area. And we have a new kid on the block, just published this week. So we've got working with the Learning and Engagement Manifesto. We have Museum Essentials working ethically, working with collections, and also working with museum partners. And our commitment is to add to this online content to support the MA's priorities and the sector needs in general. So we've talked about climate chaos, we've also in crisis, and we've also started talking about anti-racism as priorities for this area of work. From an AMA perspective, and it's so lovely to see Maria, Joanna, Stephen, Sarah, Helen as an ex-alumni, a whole raft of different people as well as mentors in this space, is the one that you're probably most familiar with. So it's positioned as a self-directed professional development programme. It has a range of different elements to support your learning. So we have a competency framework that essentially enables you to do a checklist around what you're good at. So we advocate a strengths analysis, but also what you want to develop, a gap analysis. There are opportunities to participate in support groups. There's dedicated funding from the Benevolent Fund that you can apply for, either to pay for fees or for professional development outside of what the MA offers. That's a really important benefit. If you're an AMA candidate or one of our alumni, you can apply for funding to pay for opportunities outside of our own good events and conference programme. A whole raft of resources. So what you might need to think about if you're a volunteer doing the AMA, mentoring is a clear and grounded, significant component to the AMA programme. And that really enables you to work very closely with your mentor over the course of the 3 years to develop yourself. And then we also have events. So we run a rate of workshops that support you within all of this. For example, navigating ethical practice. We've got some videos and films on our website. So if this has sparked your interest, please visit the website and just search for associateship. And you can either hear from the amazing Steph Mastoris or myself about what this programme looks like in more detail. So mentoring is another key component, not only of the AMA, but also in terms of what we've done. And COVID enabled us to put in place 3 brand new programmes to support individuals. And the reason that individual mentoring is so important is that it enables it to be far more bespoke. It enables you to work out what you need to talk about at a particular point in time. And it also enables you to perhaps share a more vulnerable side if you're dealing with uncertainty or new ways of working or new challenges that perhaps you haven't thought about before. Now, we ran 4 suites of mentoring programs in 2020 to 2021. They had really good and high participation rates and satisfaction rates. And so we are continuing on that theme. So the current live mentoring program that is available is our career conversations, and that's focused primarily on career next steps, aspirations and professional development. It's an hour's conversation with me. So if you want to book a call, please email me. And as a result of that conversation, you get some supportive resources and some self-directed learning to enable you then to take it to the next stage. The FMA is probably the one thing that people are less familiar with. So the AMA is all around learning. It's positioned around learning and distance travel. The FMA is also about learning, but equally it's about legacy. So it is about what have you contributed? How has that been embedded? How has it transformed the sector? And that's that subtle difference. By all means, if you're a leader in the organisational sector or you have aspirations to be one, then the FMA development framework is just for you. So again, you'll see this looks very, very familiar. So we have competencies to guide to focus your development. We have informal peer groups that you can connect with, funding, resources, opportunities to be more involved. So for example, if I'm doing any sort of piece of work, whether it's about digital engagement or about workforce review, the people that are doing the fellowship will be invited to participate a little bit more. And then you get access to our amazing professional reviewers, of which we have one in the audience, Hilliam and McGowan. So the quote I put up right at the beginning was around confidence and competence. And I do think that's all great, but actually we can't do that without having capacity. And by capacity, I mean time, but I also mean wellness. So it's really heartening to hear our new president talk about that important component part. So our workforce commitment to your capacity, our workforce commitment to your well-being is varied. And this is the whistle-stop tour. So we have a new wellbeing hub. And we have resources that talk around how to deal with cyberbullying, Sticks and Stones, our research around workplace bullying. I'm in the process of developing some digital resources around digital wellbeing. I did a presentation last week. In addition, we have our Facebook groups. So if you currently can't work, or you're made redundant, or you're furloughed, then by all means, please join our COVID support group. We have a really lovely dialogue, a really supportive approach. So it really is your oasis. And if you're a manager, we also have a similar group where you might want to utilise other people's experience and advice. We have lots of other content over the last 12 months, and I really wanted to signpost that. What I know is that there's been so much material, not only delivered by the MA, which has been fantastic, but delivered by the sector as a whole. And I feel I've missed out. So occasionally I'll hear about a live event or a conference that just for whatever reason, my head was down and I missed it. So we have lots of these resources available on our website. So just go and have a look at that content from last year. It's all there for the taking. So this is the question I asked you to start thinking about, and really would encourage you to ring fence time to think about your professional development needs. You spend more time at work with people you don't love or care about than you do with the people you choose to spend your life with. So if you want to feel like you're thriving and developing, reflecting on these questions over a glass of wine or tea and cake, whatever your preference, can really, really help you make the most of 2021. We've talked about all of those professional development opportunities very quickly, but if there are any of them that spark your interest, please don't hesitate to give me a call, email me, happy to bore you at length around all of these opportunities. But going back to the whole idea around confidence and competence, capacity is really important. So whilst you're thinking about your professional development needs, I would really just highlight, think about what your capacity needs are as well. What support do you need? And be honest. What can your line manager do? What can your organisation do? What can your peers and co-workers do? And also, how can you support yourself? Is there anything that you're doing? You've got a maladaptive coping mechanism that's meaning that you're not necessarily always in the best situation to pull it out of the bag. Mine is looking at Twitter for hours in the middle of the night. That's my maladaptive coping mechanism. But think about not only your professional development needs, but also your capacity needs. Now that brings me, I hope, to my final slide. I am going to stop sharing. And according to my time, I have 5 minutes for questions. So if anyone has got any questions, either feel free to put them in the chat function and I will then respond to those in a moment. Or feel free to put your hand up using the reaction. Let me just show you how to do it. Hopefully it's going to work. You see that my hand is raised. And then you can ask me a question before I hand over to the next person. So, any questions from anybody about anything I've talked about? This is when there's usually stony silence, which is absolutely fine. Thanks, Hilary. Any questions about anything that I've talked about in terms of the AMA, FMA, Museum Essentials, career conversations? Maybe I've just been too straightforward. This is good feedback. Thanks, Rachel. Wonderful. So I'm going to give it a little bit more time. Just going to check the chat function, which is why I'm looking away. Certainly the AMA, when I first joined, it was focused very much around entry level or early career, but what I have seen and what we've put in place now is a far more robust programme that enables people that perhaps are at a career crossroads to think about their professional development. So we've got lots of people that are doing the AMA now that have been in the sector for 20 years. But actually what they want is to have a dedicated framework to help them develop. Also, as part of that, what we want to ensure is that we put in place support at other levels. So emergency mentoring is an example of a programme we put in place last year. We haven't replicated it yet this year because it's only just May, but that was focused very clearly on individuals either at a leadership or technical area that wanted to have one-to-one support for an hour and a half with a list of our dedicated mentors and fellows, Hilary of which is one. And the response rate was really high, the participation rate was really high. Interestingly, though, in our most recent batch, we had a lower participation rate. And I don't know if that was a function of winter or fatigue or other opportunities, but it was really interesting. There was definitely a different sense when we ran it again. In terms of freelancers, Vicky, so that was great. So that was going to be my next point. So it's Freelancer Week coming up in the middle of June. And I think what's for me is really important is that all of our programs are proofed in terms of language and opportunity to meet freelancer needs. I certainly, if I was a freelancer working perhaps, in a void of an organisation with no HR support or no line management support, and I might well feel as if I'm working in a very isolated way, I think the AMA and the FMA are really good examples of where you can get access to mentors and other individuals, access to funding, which often as a freelancer is the biggest limiting factor around professional development, because you don't want to take your very slim profit margin and shove it necessarily back into professional development. But the AMA and the FMA enables you to do that. So there are lots of opportunities, and we always want to meet your needs. So if there's anything that you think we could be doing or should be doing, then please let me know. We can fashion it in, capacity permitting, to what we do going forward. So I definitely clear it's now 15, nearly 23. That's the end of my time. But please let me know if you've got any other questions. I'm now going to pass over to Simon, who's going to carry on for the rest of the session. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Tamsin. That was brilliant. And I think there's a few questions in the chat that Tamsin might be able to answer, but I think she covered nearly everything as has been said. So now we've got a short break, actually, so for 5 minutes. Our next session is on decolonising museums. That was going to be a double-hander between Alistair Brown, our policy manager, and Antonia, our policy and campaigns officer. Unfortunately, Antonia's not very well, so it's just going to be Alistair. But we do have a presentation as part of this by Julia Webb-Harvey, who is a volunteer at the Museum of Cornish Life. So I'll put the holding slide on. So go away for 5 minutes and go to the loo, make some tea. I'm going to have a bit of lemon and polenta cake, and I'll see you back in 5 minutes. We've got a bit of time after, so there's plenty of time. I'm now going to hand over to Alistair Brown. Alistair is the policy manager at the Museums Association, and Alistair is going to lead an interactive session exploring decolonisation, including the work of the MA's Decolonisation Guidance Working Group. So, Alistair, over to you.
Hi, Simon. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to be taking us through a session for the next little bit about decolonisation and the work that the MA has been doing on decolonising museums practice. As Simon mentioned, my colleague Antonio, who's been working with me on this, would have been joining us today, but is unfortunately ill. So I will do my best to run through the presentation myself, and then we have Julia joining us after my presentation to talk a bit about a sort of local example of this practice. So I think it'll be really, really good. I'm going to share some slides with everybody just now. Let's get that up. So so decolonisation in practice. So I want to just start with this slide. These are images that have absolutely dominated our social media feeds and our traditional media feeds, and discussion and debate in society over the past year. Things that we'll all be very familiar with. The dunking of the Colston statue in Bristol Harbour, right through to the Black Lives Matter protests that started in the States almost a year ago, last summer, and this means that sort of decolonisation seems to be everywhere at the moment. It just feels like it's absolutely at the very top of the agenda in museums and in society at large. But I think what I want to address today is perhaps less so these big moments of change and of kind of deep symbolism that we've seen over the last year, and more try to think about how this agenda has an application to museums everywhere across the country, and how we can translate this some of these ideas and critiques into museum practice today. And I want to start with just really the super basics of this. Why actually bother doing this work in the first place? Why decolonize museums? And really, from the Museums Association's point of view, this is absolutely vital work. It's a moral and ethical imperative that we reckon with museums' colonial legacy. Museums are an absolutely core part of, increasingly sort of recognised as being a core part of the colonial apparatus, and particularly sort of in the 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries. They very much born out of the colonial era and are the storehouse for much of what was collected during the colonial period. And that means that museums are intimately linked with the colonial history of the UK, and of course, museums abroad also have their own colonial legacies to contend with as well. In their role as both storehouse and sort of shop window for the empire, museums have actually ended up repeating many of the mistakes and misrepresentations that came with the empire. So this is about museums excluding and misrepresenting people. So often, this is in ethnographic and anthropological collections, misrepresenting people and indeed their descendants, and continuing to do that today. So you have numerous examples of mislabeled or badly researched or willfully incorrect representations of history in museum collections and in museum displays that often just sit there and by virtue of sheer inertia continue in place right into the 21st century. And I think one thing that we're really keen to get across is that that's not something that has zero impact. It's actually, if you have approaches to collections and displays that continue to misrepresent people, that often has the impact of reinforcing racist stereotypes, reinforcing negative stereotypes about places that are former colonies of the UK. So and that can be something as simple and as innocuous as having photos in a social history collection that include people blacking up or doing other behaviour that might be that would be seen today as being completely unacceptable and abhorrent. And finally, museums also, and this is perhaps the more obvious point, museums hold collections of items that were stolen or obtained under duress during the colonial period, and for which there are increasingly loud calls for return or restitution. So that's certainly part of the question about decolonising museums as well. And just to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about, here's a photo of the Pitt Rivers Museum. In many respects, a fantastic museum, but also a museum that is guilty of many of the things that I've just discussed. Of being a museum that repeats many misrepresentations and mistakes and errors about colonized peoples, about their history, and indeed about their present. And it's also a museum that is doing lots to tackle this head on. So we're working very closely with the team at Pitt Rivers as part of our decolonisation guidance working group to understand what they're doing to bring their museum into the 21st century. And some of you will be familiar with some of the more kind of high profile things that they've done. So they've removed, famously removed their shrunken heads from display. And they're doing a whole host of other things in the background to really change the museum and make it more fit for the 21st century. I think that also there's a lot of misconceptions about decolonising practice in the UK. We define it as really any action that seeks to correct museums' institutional biases. that relates to colonial history. So that might be around collections practices, but it might also be around knowledge, skills, representation gaps that exist due to colonial actions and attitudes in the past and in the present. I think that's really important. So it's not just about correcting just correcting a label for the sake of it. It's about understanding that actually to change how a collection is understood and displayed can have an impact on how we have on how society exists and reproduces itself in the 21st century. So some really key things here is that although I've just shown you a photo of the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is the absolute classic example of a sort of ethnographic colonial era museum, the point is that every museum can use decolonizing practice. So size, type, location, it's not a barrier to taking this decolonizing lens and applying it to your museum, to your collection, to your displays, to your workforce practices. So it's something that absolutely everybody can do, and that's partly because, as I say, the next point here, it's not just about repatriation, it's not just about restitution. So it's not about taking an item that was looted and finding out who it originally belonged to and giving it back. That might be part of it, but it can also be about reassessing your collections, reassessing your displays, reassessing what stories you're telling to your audiences, and that might be in relation to colonial history, but it might also be in relation to industrial history here in the UK, and the question about what markets were used for the things that were produced, or where raw materials came. There's a huge number of different links and histories that are worth pursuing with this lens, and so I think there's value for absolutely everybody in looking at this and using this lens. I think the fourth bullet point here is really important, that decolonizing practice is, in most cases, it's a long-term process. It involves lots of different areas of work, and so it often pull in people who are working in different departments, whether that's front of house or collections and curatorial work, or learning and engagement. It's something that the more holistic it is, the better it is, and also it's not a quick fix. It's not a case of just saying, okay, well, we've given this item back, or we've changed this label, so tick, we've decolonized, we've done it. Actually, it's much better if it's something that's done in collaboration and in partnership with lots of different organizations, and seen as a way of involving new and different audiences and groups in the museum and in the museum's work. So here are a few examples of the kind of work that I'm talking about. I will work my way around these. So in the top left corner, we've got the Benin, one of the Benin bronzes. And of course, this is again a really classic example of repatriation and restitution as being part of decolonizing practice. So we've seen calls for many years for the Benin bronzes, which were looted, and there's absolutely no doubt about that, looted from Benin City, which is now in Nigeria, in 1897, and then were dispersed to museums across the world, including many in the UK. And we've seen a real movement in the past few months on repatriating Benin bronzes, including most recently in the UK from the University of Aberdeen. That was a really big move by the museum there, and indeed from museums in Germany and elsewhere. There's certainly still a long way to go, and a lot more brave decision making that needs to be done in that case, but I think it's an example of where change is happening. I'll move sort of clockwise around these. So the large display that you can see here in the blue room is the Past Is Now exhibition of Birmingham Museums, and this is a display which is a few years old now. I think was launched in 2017, ran through 2018 at Birmingham Museums, which has been enormously influential in the sector in terms of inspiring other elements of decolonising practice. This was, and I went to it, it was absolutely fascinating. It really took a really interesting deep look at Birmingham Museum's collections to understand how they represented Birmingham's relationship with the British colonial project, and not just what was in there that did represent Birmingham's links with colonialism, but also the major gaps that were in there as well. So they looked at, for example, the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya in the 1950s. And looked at the very small number of objects that they had from that, despite the actually very substantial links that Birmingham had with putting down the uprising there. So that was absolutely fascinating and was a very challenging exhibition, but has really had a huge influence in the sector. The next one down here is the old statues issue, which has obviously become a huge issue, not just less so in museums than in the wider sort of public realm, but it is something that has certainly touched on museums. So this is a Robert Milligan statue, which was sited by the Museum of London outside the Museum of London Docklands. Robert Milligan, a noted slave owner and trader, and his statue was removed by the museum and in collaboration with the Mayor of London during last summer. And I think it shows the links here around the public the public realm issues and museums. These things are often linked. They're often issues around what museums display in their grounds or on their buildings in terms of statuary and so on, that museums need to interrogate as well. And I think we're seeing a lot of that happening at the moment. And then finally, another example that I really like is Percy Powell Cotton in the bottom left-hand corner here. Powell Cotton gave us the Powell Cotton Museum in Kent, and it's again a very typical museum of a colonial collector who's brought back not just ethnographic items, but also a large natural history collection, which the museum's been working really hard to interrogate and address its natural history collections with a decolonizing lens, and really to kind of move it away from this kind of sort of very, very colonial sort of white savior approach, and sort of white savior on safari approach, and to being much more about the places where these animals, stuffed animals and so on, are where they come from, what and what their natural history really is. So I really like these examples of practice, but again, there's lots more out there. There's lots more going on, and I'd love to hear more from you about what's happening. And I thought it'd be really good to just dwell for a moment on the idea of communicating decolonizing practice, because I think this can be something that a lot of organizations get stuck on, is that actually what's most important when you start doing decolonizing work is actually, the important thing is to get on with it, and to consider, you know, what your objectives are, what you want to do, and to make sure that there is a real kind of organizational commitment to doing the work, so that, you know, that you are definitely purposefully doing this kind of work, using this kind of decolonizing lens, thinking about how you represent colonialism, and how you can change that in your collections and in your displays. But what you don't have to do is necessarily suddenly label all of your work as decolonial. You don't necessarily need to say we have a new decolonizing strategy. You know, it will depend on your context. That might be something that you want to do, but again, some organizations find that term really controversial. It might be that you want to use a different term, or simply, you know, get on with the work behind the scenes. So, you know, some organizations call this, you know, reassessing history, you know, different terms. It's about what works for you and in your concept, in your context. And finally, I would say, you know, it is important to consider how you will deal with any queries or criticisms about any actions that you take. And this could be from any side of the kind of political divide, as, you know, museums who are doing this are experiencing at the moment. So issues around relabeling, redisplaying, moving items off display, you know, all of this has been often needlessly contentious in the past few months, but it's good to think about how you're going to communicate that and be really positive about the commitment that you're making to doing this kind of work. I think the final thing to say on this is that, you know, this kind of practice really is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to reimagine museums and reimagine the stories that they tell. It's an opportunity to redefine, in some cases, a museum's whole purpose. You can build trust, you can build new relationships with organizations, and create greater connections between the collections that we hold and the people who created them, or who take a close interest in them. And it's an opportunity to champion equity and justice. To come back to that point at the beginning, we think it's a moral imperative, an ethical imperative to do this work. But it's also an opportunity to do a lot with your collection. So the MA is doing lots of work around decolonizing museums. We've got a link here, which I very much encourage you to have a look at, with loads of information about museums that are already doing work in this area. And we've got links to great podcasts, videos, lots of blogs and academic work around this. And of course, we also have a decolonization guidance working group, which is a small group of people who are really dedicated to this work, who are in the process of producing some guidance, which we hope will be published later this year. So lots of stuff happening on the kind of decolonizing museums agenda at the Museums Association. And I will, at this point, hand over to Julia, because I think what would be really helpful is to hear about a local example of some of how some of these ideas are being put into practice. I will stop sharing there and see if Julia is available soon. Fantastic.
Yes, I'm here. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I will check that I can share my screen. I think I can. There we go. And okay, so I've got, I hope, a very practical example of what we've been doing at the Museum of Cornish Life in Helston. I'm a volunteer, so I'm a volunteer researcher at the moment, and so that's my role within the museum. I'm not a staff member, but I'm a very, very keen volunteer, and my skills, I guess, for the museum are as a writer. So I thought I'd I'd just take you through how we started, what we've done to date, and what we hope to do. So it all started with just a massive dose of curiosity and a desire to join in the discussion, and that was really our interest was piqued with the images that Alistair shared at the beginning of his presentation. So the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter and a desire to join in, but at the same time we had this real hesitancy about how to do it, how to do it, and how could we make it relevant to the visitors, to the people that engage with the museum in the Museum of Cornish Life. It's a very, those of you, I would assume you don't know the museum. It's a very varied collection, but it's quite got a heavy domestic feel. We got Victorian kitchen, a 1950s shop. It's very trade specific, so we look at Cornish trades, mining, fishing, wrecks. We've got quite a large display about Henry Trengrouse, who was the a sort of Cornish hero who designed the buoyancy aids and life-saving rocket equipment. So we were really concerned about putting this big label of decolonizing on what is quite a local a market audience. And also we were concerned because of, well, I was concerned because of my whiteness, my white voice, middle-class woman. So really what authority, I guess, did we have in that? And we also started with no real clear plan of how to go about it, or what we might do. But we decided we'd just start, and it's the entry objects were these two assagai, which were literally folded in white paper and stored in the eaves of the museum. And the director of the museum, Annette McTavish, had said, well, these are just such odds with many of the items in the collection, so maybe we'll just start with these two items. So with that in mind, and then the next stage was I spent some time interrogating the museum's database, so the modes database, and this link here is to Crescent Kerno, so the Cornish Archive Centre, who have some really excellent guidance on how to search, or some hints really on how to search your own records, and what keywords. So and the image on the right of my screen is my notebook. So these are the notes that I was making at the time, and I'm just going to look at my notes. So the key search terms that we were using were things like empire, Boer, slave, ivory, Africa, Negro, Black history, colonial. So, and in doing that in a couple of volunteer sessions, so normally my volunteer sessions are 3 or 4 hours, I came up with a list of 20 or so items, and then began the process of then trying to find the hidden stories, or find out what the other stories were. So the project then progressed with a healthy dose of curiosity, permission to take time. I think this is really important. Alistair mentioned it. We started the conversations in June last year within the museum. Also, we had an initial meeting with Gina Goska, who was really helpful to us. And the first blog I posted up was in January this year. So there was a lot of looking and thinking and reading. I spent a lot of time in October trying to diversify the feeds, I guess. So what I followed on Instagram, what I followed on Twitter, where I joined a book club that was looking with more diverse writers. Jumped on a couple of training events, just really to try and broaden my mindset. And we've always tried to have a tone that's quite open, quite questioning. We are very concerned not to become a new expert. And so these, and the output has been a series of blog posts. Sorry, I should have said that at the beginning. Another key thing was the suspending an anxiety about getting things right. So having a permission to, you know, make mistakes or be just curious. So if you don't know the answer, is to say that you haven't come across an answer. And I'll save that last point. So if I just talk very, very briefly about the objects then that have come up. So the first one is the sugar nip. So this curious scissor-like contraption, which was in most Victorian kitchens. So it's an object that fits very well within the collection. Debunk some of the myths that sugar was just for the privileged. It was really in the household of the poor, and then obvious connections to slavery, plantations. And then trying to bring that back into to make it relevant to Cornish life, then I linked up with just double checking the UCL project. So that has a massive database that lists all the legacies of payments made for compensation for British slave owners in colonial parts. So I came up with a list of the families in Cornwall that were compensated and the amounts of that. So tying that right back into Cornish lives. And that generated quite a lot of interest on the social media. The next image is a display case in the back of the Victorian classroom. It's got this collection of Egyptian artifacts, which is completely at odds with the collection, but in following a story, we were able to find the donor. So the donor was a Margaret Taylor who was from Red Ruth, and in tracing her, I managed to find connections back to the Egypt Exploration Foundation that was around in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And again, so that's been hugely popular with our visitors or online visitors, because of course we're shut. But you know, because everybody seems to love things Egyptian. But the issue that's coming out of that is so that we've got this collection that probably relates back to those times, but you know, who really do they belong to? And actually only just recently, but for a curatorial point of view, it's a nightmare, but there's this sticker on the back of one of the little shabtis, and it's got Nauticus written on the back, and I've matched that handwriting, we think, to Emily Patterson, who was the General Secretary of the Egypt Exploration Society. So we may even be able to tie it back to something to repatriate, but who knows, that's ongoing. The grave you can see, that's a grave of a former slave, Evarista Muchavelo, sorry, and he was a freed slave, freed by his master, who was a Cornishman who had gone to Rio for mining. So he was a migrant worker. He came back because he was dying, and he said to his slave whether he could be freed, and Evaristo chose to come back to Cornwall with him. And one of the volunteers had written a play which was aired on Radio 4 in 2012. And in that play that generated sort of some really interesting racial issues. So I was able to take 2 blogs, if you like, exploring that. And on this one, on not being afraid to get it right, we were corrected. So one of the assumptions that I'd made in the blog, second blog, was corrected by Richard Anderson, a professor, or a doctor of colonial history, for which we were hugely grateful. So I learned, always learning, but I learned as a consequence of that it was, even in 1843, British citizens could still buy slaves abroad, even though I thought that it was all dusted and done by 1834. And the last image here is a is a trowel for it's a ceremonial trowel for which was presented to the priest at the time who'd commissioned the church at Coverack to be built in the late 1800s, and the handle's ivory, and ivory obviously is the huge links to empire. I thought I was going to be, I'm in the process of writing this one. I thought I was going to be writing about again links to slavery, but also the impact that actions have 150 years ago today with the decimation of elephant population. But in doing research, I've actually found that the size of the caravans that traveled through Central Africa really impacted the local ecologies, agriculture. It created boom towns that then could go away, and actually also spread, resulted in a spread of disease and epidemic and sleeping sickness. So it's been each item has been a joy and sort of huge to write. More recently, we've had this conversation with Black Voices Cornwall, because there are a number of items in our toy collection, bizarrely, that really press against current issues of racism, and this is where we feel, or I felt, my whiteness more consciously. So we've had a really good conversation with Black Voices Cornwall, and we're hoping that a next stage will be that they come and exhibit with us and help us explore some of those. So this is the blogs. As I said, the first one was published in January. I'm doing about one a month, so taking time, and I think that's it. I will put the links into the chat function when you carry on a little bit, but if I'm on Twitter as Jules WH and my email, so if anybody thinks I can be of help, then I am, very happy to help and share my experience. I'm not sure it's knowledge, but my experience in this work. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Julia. That was really interesting. Fantastic to get an explanation of that kind of work. As I said before, we're running slightly over, but it doesn't really matter, because the final session that was going to be led by our two reps is not now happening because our two reps unfortunately can't be here. So we've got plenty of time for the final panel discussion. But just before we move on to that, does anyone have any questions for Julia or Alistair, or any queries about how to do this type of work? Raise your hand if you do, or just jump in. I'm just looking at the chat now. Lots of thanks for Julia for talking about the work, which is great. So I can't see anyone. So if not, do carry on putting stuff in the chat, and I'm sure Alistair or Julia could answer it if there is anything you've got going. But I think we'll now move to the next session, the final session, which is our panel. So if Sam, Charlotte and Philip could start their videos and join me, that would be great. Thanks to all of you. So with us we have Sam Astle, who's the head of museums at South West Heritage. We also have Charlotte Morgan, who's the collaborative programs manager at the Cornwall Museums Partnership. And finally, we have Philip Walker, who's the head of culture at Gloucester City Council. So thanks so much for joining us. It's brilliant you can be here. I think we were going to just kick off with each of the speakers talking for five minutes or so, just introducing themselves and their work, and talking about the challenges they faced under COVID and what they've learned and what they feel the sort of sector's learned, which is quite a lot, I know, but I'm sure they're up to the task. So obviously do ask questions for our panel. You can either put them in the chat or you can actually just pop up and ask them yourselves. Raise your hand and you can ask them in person. But I think we'll go in alphabetical order by surname. So Sam, do you mind going first?
Oh yeah, that's fine. Yeah, good to see you everybody. I think one of the main learning points for me from the pandemic has been the importance of networks. So it's really, really good to be here today. I think fundamentally, one of the key features or learning points has been really how much our audiences value what we do and how much they've missed coming to our sites, but how much they've enjoyed seeing us adapt and change during the pandemic as well. And I think that sets us up really well for reopening later this month. I think as a sort of museum leader within my organisation, I think a key learning point has really been the value of collaborative decision making. I think the pandemic has forced us to sort of approach our decision making in a different way. Even the most sort of basic mundane tasks have required lots of people to come together to make the right call, to make the right decisions. And I think that's been really beneficial. And I hope that's sort of here to stay. It's also meant that some new voices have been brought in more fully to that kind of decision making as well. I think particularly it's been great for the sector to see front of house teams to have their voices heard more strongly within the decision-making process within museums and within organisations. I think it's been a period where experimentation has been a key feature of life, and I think that's been really refreshing for me and for the teams that I work with, to kind of throw off the shackles really and to have a go, to sort of shorten our horizons, and to just try things and see what works and not be worried about things failing, to sort of have that opportunity and that entrepreneurial spirit within our museums and with the sector has been a positive feature of the pandemic. I think for us all as human beings as well as museum professionals, it's been, you know, a challenging time when we've really had to think about our well-being and about our buoyancy. And I think that's been on the table perhaps much more during the last 12 to 18 months than it has been previously. And I really hope that stays as a key feature when we move out of the current restrictions, that we continue to look out for one another, to be aware of kind of people's lives in 360 really, and what's happening in their personal life is of course part of how they're doing at work. And I really hope that we continue that, and we continue to look out for each other, to look after each other, and to be aware of our own well-being and our own buoyancy post-pandemic. I think also the economic value of what we do, I think a real opportunity point at the moment is to work alongside partners, businesses and communities to help boost the economies in our towns and cities as part of that post-COVID recovery. I feel that's a real opportunity for us to make the case for culture and the value that we generate through the things that we do. I think that there's an opportunity to make that case fully in the months and the period ahead. So I could go on for much longer, Simon, but they're just a few things that I've scribbled down as reflections on the last 12 months and hopes for the period ahead as well.
No, that was perfect, Sam. Thanks so much. There's definitely a lot that chimes with previous members' meetings we have. This, you know, the funny sort of strange thing, but it's been released us to sort of experiment and do interesting things, but it's also been extremely challenging. The networks are interesting, you know, finding new ones and really realising how much we depended on our existing ones. So absolutely, we've talked about these things before, and also absolutely well-being, which Gillian, our president, kicked off the day talking about wellness and well-being. So that's perfect. Yeah, over to you, Charlotte, next. I really love your background. Where's that?
It's Crackington Haven, which I think from a conversation we had a couple of months ago, Simon, you've probably been to before. Yeah, one of my favourite spots here in North Cornwall. I was thinking about this question since you sort of dropped us an email, and I've been really thinking about resilience. And the museums I work most closely with here in Cornwall have kind of proved that on an organisational level, but also on individual levels, and like Sam said, on a network level as well. So we've kind of all drawn much closer together. Our collaboration has increased hugely. from a pretty high starting point anyway in Cornwall, but has continued to kind of really grow. We're making the most of that sort of cross-pollination of ideas and delivery and reaching audiences. I think for individual museums, and I must say at CMP, we don't run any museums, we work with museums. So we've had a slightly different perspective on how the pandemic has sort of played out for the sector. I've really witnessed a huge amount of creativity, flexibility, and a real kind of passion for museum work. And I know that it certainly hasn't been an easy journey for many of the museums, or for any museum, over the last 12, probably more than 12 months now, although I don't like to think about how long it's really been. I think what we've been able to show as a sector is the value that we demonstrate for communities, the ability we have to flex in ways that we didn't really think that we could. So we've kind of been forced into situations where we've had to work with audiences in a digital way, or we've had to kind of just run at doing something completely differently. And for all of the museums that I work with anyway, they've come up trumps in terms of being able to deliver that. So I feel really proud, not just of them, but generally of the sector in terms of how we've coped with it. And yeah, I was just going to finish off with, on a resilience note, I think personal resilience within the sector has been a huge thing. But to kind of pick up on what Sam said, being resilient isn't always a great thing if you're kind of constantly being resilient. So I agree with his point about refocusing on well-being and reprioritizing that. And it's great to see so many organizations kind of building that into their recovery plans. So that was what I was, thinking about resilience.
Perfect, thanks, Charlotte. Yeah, I mean, it has been such a tough time for individuals within the sector, and Sian mentioned that earlier, the number of redundancies. We shouldn't forget the tough times that people have been through and are still going through. Really important to remember that. Philip, on to you. Your background's not quite as pretty, but it does have post-it notes.
Yeah, that's how I roll these days. It's my home office, and I just, it's come from a work home space to a kind of weird hybrid. So I'm in my spare room, which is the box room. Now it's got post-it notes. You can probably, hopefully, I should blur it out so you can't read them in case there's anything damaging politically or personally. I'm sure there isn't. I'm going to try and find my notes. So yeah, thanks for inviting me to this. And I'd agree with the points made by others. Really, it's been a massive challenge. What a year! And I think our staff initially were absolutely reeling from the kind of the impacts of particularly during the first lockdown and how it affected all our lives. And we're all still feeling the effects a year on. What did we learn? So we learned one of the things we learned is you can't feed fish remotely. And by which I mean we have live exhibits in our museum. We closed the museum's doors back in March last year, and then we suddenly thought, well, what about the fish? We've got to keep them fed. Similarly, although you can monitor collections, environmental conditions, security, etc., to a certain extent remotely, you can't. You need people on the ground opening the venues, checking on things. So you can't check if things have fallen down or got into a state of disrepair remotely entirely. So that's one of the things we learned. I'd agree with other points about staff well-being being absolutely paramount. People having to juggle homeschooling and remote working in a very short space of time was a huge challenge. What else have we learned in Gloucester? Sorry, I kind of launched in without saying where I'm from. So I work within Gloucester cultural sector, and I look after museums, live music venues, as well as historic sites and events and festivals. But I'm going to focus primarily on the museum impact. So I guess one of the things I'd say about being forced to work remotely suddenly and rapidly was that our enthusiasm for digital engagement didn't quite match our skill set. for doing it. So we went on a fairly steep learning curve around that, but successfully, I think, as well. So our engagement with remote audiences was really positive during the past 12 months, and is something we're building on. But yeah, we learned we weren't very good at it to start with, and we still got a lot to learn. What else have I learned personally? Cats love Zoom. My cat might make an appearance anytime now. Apologies in advance. The benefits that we faced as a local authority set of services was that whilst we weren't able to furlough staff, it was very difficult to keep them engaged, and staff who were particularly around front of house staff who were used to interaction of frontline roles, and also they didn't have all of the kit that other members of staff had, which is laptops, etc. They weren't able to suddenly switch to remote working easily at all. So keeping them engaged and keeping them occupied and feeling part of things was a real challenge, but also an opportunity to engage them inventively and creatively. So we took the opportunity to look at a 5-year museum development plan in Gloucester, which we've now completed and published. We haven't completed the 5-year plan, we've got to deliver it now, but we're in the process of rolling that out. So that's given us time to reflect, which has been positive. Some of the other things that I would say more broadly is that museums can definitely contribute and have contributed to the national recovery. So some examples being museums being used as COVID test centres or vaccination centres. We were approached for possibility of setting up a Nightingale Court to support the kind of legal systems. We didn't in the end follow through with that. It wasn't the appropriate site, but those kinds of ways that tangentially the heritage and museum sector managed to support. In Museum of Gloucester, that I oversee, that we were involved in distribution of thousands of wellbeing packs to support people's mental health and well-being, and also creating activities for families to do during lockdown to support their learning, but also just to support them in different ways. So they were packs and activities which related back to our museum collections. So it was a good way to kind of be active, to be visible in the city and be part of a recovery in terms of people's well-being. So yeah, that was a really positive outcome, I think, for us. Other things we did, we went largely remote. We created remote digital exhibitions online, which again helped us engage with. So we did a lockdown, a Life in Lockdown exhibition, which invited contributions from our community to kind of document their experiences and then contribute that to what has become an online exhibition. It might become a physical one in the future, who knows, but all of that material can then either become part of the museum collection or can be support the archives of this kind of momentous time that we've been living through. Those are some of my reflections about what we've been doing. I think we've got a lot to learn in terms of digital. I think more recently, so I guess my recent concerns are around how we come out of this stage of our latest lockdown. So it's been really difficult. I think recovery is slow and confidence is still low in terms of rushing back into museums. And also I'm kind of frustrated by the challenge that we have about the steps in which we were allowed to come back. So we bravely or foolishly opened our museum shop, which we were allowed to do when a non-essential retail reopened, and we've had incredibly low numbers because we're competing around the corner with the likes of Primark, where everyone was queuing up for. But so things are slow. Confidence is slow in terms of visitors, and I think things will take time, but we're on that road now. We're on that track, so it's really positive to see that we can open, we can engage people when we are opening from the next week or so's time. So one final thing is we don't know what visitor habits will look like, so we just need to take it a step at a time, and engaging our visitors, reassuring, encouraging and responding to them. So museums being responsive, I think, will be a trait we need to exploit and work on. So that's probably all from me. Thank you.
Brilliant, Philip. Thanks. That's really interesting. And ending on audiences and sort of attitudes of visitors. We're looking at putting together a piece in next museum's journal on that, because it is one of the unknowns is how audience will react and change. So maybe we can make that the next question, Sam. I mean, has sort of has your relationship with visitors changed over COVID, and if so, how? And what do you see the future looking like in terms of engaging audiences?
Yeah, good, really good area and good question. I think a bit like Phil, really, we've grown massively in the last year in terms of our digital delivery. We're doing things now that we just were not doing, or would have taken a long time to get off the ground had we not had the sort of demand of the pandemic. So, online talks, sounds quite simple now, but and we're doing it all the time, but just something we hadn't done previously. So kind of that digital delivery, again, just having a go. Digital exhibitions have now become part of what we do, and just like our on-site exhibitions. So all of that's really COVID, I suppose, has been a catalyst for all of that to happen. In terms of the digital delivery as well, we've had quite a lot of fun with trialing a charging model, a kind of tiered basis of charging for some of that digital or those online talks. And again, that's been a really interesting area to experiment with. So offering those talks on a charge basis, so starting from £5 to £7 or £11. So and enabling visitors or audiences to make a decision about at what level they want to support us and the work that we do. And that's been really successful again, and would be a good one, I think, to share more widely at some point within the sector. I also think kind of some of the analog stuff that we do is going to be really important in the period ahead, and in a big rural place like Somerset, it's going to be really important that as part of the recovery we're visible in community settings. Not everyone can get to one of our museum sites, not everyone's inclined to engage digitally either, so we want to be out there in village halls, in doctors' surgeries, providing the chance for people to engage with stories and museum collections. So as well as that digital growth in the period ahead as well, actually I think some really kind of simple, straightforward yet effective on the ground audience engagement is going to be really important and crucial too. So a few reflections from me there, Simon.
Thanks, Sam. Charlotte, how about you? Obviously, CMP doesn't, as you said, doesn't run museums. But what have the people you support been telling you about audiences and what they need and what they see it look like going forward?
Yeah, we've been obviously working really closely with our museum partners to kind of trial new ways of working, respond in a sort of flexible and hopefully useful way through the last year. Just picking up on what Sam said there about analog ways of engagement. Yeah, massive challenges here in Cornwall in terms of the digital divide, and I think that's been felt more through the pandemic in terms of people who don't have access to tech or even access to Wi-Fi at home. So we've been working with the food banks network here in Cornwall to deliver wellbeing and arts packs alongside the food packages throughout the pandemic, and that's been a really great way of making sure that activities are available for everybody in Cornwall depending on need. At the other end of the scale, we've also been able to trial really innovative ways of doing things, and a bit of a shout out to the Esme Fairburn Collections Fund, because we were able to get some funding from them to run a project exploring using chatbots and smart speakers to navigate oral history collections. So we were able to work with the Music Heritage Trust here in Cornwall, Crescent Kerno, and some of the museums and some of the tech companies here to create and forgive me because I'm not the innovation manager at CMP, so the tech language is not my forte. But yeah, so to create an app that you can access if you have an Amazon smart speaker, and I'm not using the word because I have one next to me and she'll start speaking to you, or if I'm not careful, and ask questions, explore oral histories, and have stories retold through that, which is really exciting. Feels like a really great way for us to get to audiences without them visiting museums, potentially reach new audiences who don't visit museums, but also to kind of continue the conversation maybe post-visit, or at the end of the summer holidays when people have gone home. They don't have to be in Cornwall then to access the collections. So yeah, both ends of the scale for us in terms of analog and some really exciting innovative digital stuff as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's lots of people experience. It's yeah, some really exciting stuff, but also thinking about the analog. There's a few comments coming in. Hilary, I don't know if you wanted to ask something directly, or you want me to relate that comment about the old-fashioned. Hilary said, like what you said, Sam, the old-fashioned stuff will be so important. Digital won't always be the answer. I guess Philip, maybe. I mean, going forward, how are you going to decide what you keep for the digital stuff you've done, and then what you jettison when museums fully reopen? Is that a difficult call to make?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one, because any organisation's got a finite resource, so that finite resource, whilst it might be able to focus on digital stuff now, it's actually got a whole range of other things it will need to do when we do open our doors. So what do we jettison? It's something that we're grappling with, don't know, because actually you don't want to jettison anything quite yet, because it might be too soon, or it might be the wrong thing. So I think it is a little bit about kind of seeing how things evolve, and I wouldn't rush back to do what we did before. I'd kind of like, let's see what audiences want. So I think it's, and it's the comment I made earlier, I think it's about being responsive. So I think we just need to tread kind of, not but just be responsive to what audiences are telling us, and what they're wanting, what they're confident about doing, where they feel they want to go, and try and support that, I think. So yeah, I think I wouldn't be too quick to jettison stuff. And also digital kind of stuff will last, and it's just content that's been generated. It's still there. It's still going to be, you can still kind of share content through channels. So it's not, yeah. And I also wouldn't, I agree with Sam. I don't want to get too hung up about just becoming a digital channel. We're not. We're a kind of immersive, whole range of different ways in which people interact with us. So yeah, that's what I'd say. I wouldn't jettison things too quickly, and we just don't have the resource to. So
that makes sense, Philip. Yeah, that sounds a good approach, doesn't it? Listening to audiences and being responsive sounds a good way forward. And Vicky Dawson's asked here, talking about the evaluation of digital take up, impact, audience profile, and incentive to visit the actual museum. Sam, did you have any views on that? How are you assessing the impact of what you've done digitally? Is it difficult to assess, or?
Yeah, I think it is an interesting question. I'm become pretty adept at evaluating our sort of on-site visitors pre-pandemic, but actually, in terms of the kind of value you're generating through digital engagement, I think as a sector we probably do need to kind of think a little bit more about what the kind of metrics are. How do we evaluate? How do we know what kind of success looks like in terms of digital? Because there's the obvious things like likes or shares on social media, but actually sort of going into a bit more kind of depth, I think is going to be really, really important going forward. So I think it's a good question. I don't probably have a clear answer to it, but I think as things kind of catch up a little bit as well, there's been big digital explosion, particularly in my organisation, and Phil's right. It's because there's been resources that otherwise would be channeled elsewhere have had this kind of capacity. I think there's probably going to be a bit of catching up to do now. We've implemented these new systems and approaches, but actually how do we kind of sustain them, and how do we understand what the impact of those kind of initiatives and innovations is? So I think over the sort of next 6 months to the year, hopefully you know, that process can begin, and we can analyze things with a bit more clarity and a bit more detail.
Brilliant, thanks, Sam. I guess, Charlotte, a sort of similar question to you, really. Is impact of digital work, is that something that you know, people that you support want support from you to do? Is it an issue?
Yeah, and I think it's worth remembering that we're only just getting towards, you know, the first year of delivering this type of digital work. So although I think a lot of organisations did a bit of digital before, you know, as Sam and Vicky highlighted in her question, you know, it's been a real explosion of work in the last 12 months. So I think in terms of evaluating that, it's going to be quite tricky for, you know, until we're open and we can really see the difference. I do think that there are you know, new ways of thinking about evaluation as well. So while it's always great to get feet through the door, some of these new digital things won't be about maybe incentivizing museum visits, thinking about different ways to really have meaningful engagement with visitors that's not about being in the space. So some of the museums I've worked with have been delivering virtual visits for care homes. I know this is something that lots of museums across the country have been doing. And it's really unlikely that those people would visit the museum because of their various maybe health conditions or other limitations placed upon them. So actually I think it's an opportunity to kind of rethink that model as well in terms of how we think about a museum visitor, really.
Thanks, Charlotte. Yeah, absolutely, I agree. Helen Daniels has made the point in the chat about sort of learning from other museums, right, basically, which is a kind of obvious one, but an important one. She said she attended the GEM-led session at the MA conference about creating engaging digital content on a budget, and it was inspirational. So yeah, I think there's a lot we can learn from each other, and obviously the MA tries to facilitate that. And just a small plug, there will be lots of digital sessions at this year's MA conference in November. There was a comment a bit earlier on from Rachel, actually. I think it's not exactly a question, but I think it's interesting. It's a question about how sort of merging back together as teams, because obviously lots of people have been through very different experiences within museums and within museum services, some furloughed, some working like anything and learning lots of new things. Maybe Philip, you could kick us off on that. Is that something you're having to think about? How once furlough ends and everyone comes back together, how staff are integrated and work together?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really interesting time, because I kind of created almost a museum team, but during lockdown last year. So there was some recruitment to key roles within our museums, so both collections roles and engagement role. I say roles, I just mean a collections officer and an engagement officer, which there just wasn't very much resource there before. So I guess I've been in the slightly different position, but recruiting during lockdown was massive. Just obviously it was massively challenged. So people leaving and starting jobs and getting them kind of integrated with a team was difficult. But I guess finding ways. So immediately I sort of threw them the challenge of generating a museum development plan. So they had very quickly to work around quite a considered and intense piece of work, which was really stretching all of their experience. So I think that helped massively. So I've got a team that are now very gelled as a consequence, even though a lot of it is their contact was remote. So there was, but in the last 2 weeks since we've been going back, so we had a number of people who were disconnected from that, who were working before and hadn't met those people. So yeah, that is now taking place, and it's the benefit of having a stepped phase back and being able to open a shop is I've managed to get some of those teams to start to meet and interact and kind of get to know one another again. And because you can't do it, you can't do that remotely, and people are three-dimensional. And it's this last year it's been really easy to just see people in 2D. And it's really important to get them together. So I think having projects which brought people together was good, but yeah, getting people in the same room, there's nothing quite like that, even if it's but in socially distanced fashion. So yeah, getting people together, bringing them around spaces and around projects would be one recommendation, I would say.
Brilliant, Philip. That makes sense. Sam, how about you? How sort of you kept team morale up and in these difficult circumstances?
I think it's needed like constant attention, really. I'd say in terms of the kind of buoyancy and morale of staff. I'd say in terms of the digital working overall, there's some kind of tasks that are kind of well suited to working together virtually, but actually some of the other kind of tasks are quite difficult. Some of the creative processes which we're involved with as museum professionals, whether it's exhibition or content development, just don't work as well, I don't think, remotely. It kind of really helps to be in the room and to be sort of bouncing ideas off each other. I think overall, I think in terms of the return to work, and again, one of the benefits of the pandemic, it's made us all think a little bit more about kind of how we work together, and not just kind of what we do and why we do it, but actually how we literally do our jobs, how we come together as individuals and teams to collaborate and to support, to help each other, to guide each other through challenging processes or questions. And I think that has been a real benefit of this kind of reflective time that we've all had. So I'm really keen in terms of my teams that kind of return to work involves some conversations going forward about how that might kind of pan out, and also that return to work, as Phil has alluded to, is a kind of managed, considered process. We've all had very different experiences in the last 12 months and in kind of different places, so actually needs to be considered, and that kind of staged, managed process of getting people back into sort of a blended kind of working environment, I think will be really important. So just really spending some time at this moment on that reintegration is important. I think setting time aside to bring teams back together, to support staff, and to get used to more face-to-face working, rather than just pretending, at the end of June we're all going to be back in the office again. Actually, it's not going to kind of work like that. So yeah, that'd be my kind of reflections.
No, again, really interesting, Sam. You need to put the time in. It is very labour intensive, but it's vital to do. Charlotte, how about CMP? What's I guess the staffing is a major issue for the people, for the museums you support. How have they found it, and what are they thinking about going forward?
Yeah, I think it's definitely been a challenge for the museums we support, but also for us. We've had an awful lot of staff changes over the last year, so some people have moved roles. We've had new roles where sort of funding has been earmarked for a number of years for particular positions. So we've got quite adept at induction during lockdown, which is a whole nother kettle of fish in terms of getting to know a group of new people and all of those sorts of things. I was one of those people and didn't know how tall my colleagues were for about 3 months. So that was an interesting start to work. But yeah, I think certainly for the museums, some have been able to continue a certain amount of on-site contact, like Philip was describing. Certain things can't be done from home, and lots of the museums in Cornwall have got very small teams, maybe 1 or only 2 people. So for some people that's been fairly straightforward in terms of maintaining those relationships, and for other people at the other end of the scale in Cornwall, we've got completely volunteer-run organisations who haven't seen each other since March of last year, haven't used Zoom, are scared about reopening. So there's a lot of navigating the sort of volunteer workforce side of things as well, in terms of getting people back on board. So I think that's a whole other challenge that lots of us will be considering. Yeah, I think CMP wise, as I said, we've had quite a lot of change, but it will be really exciting to see people in person for the first time in a long time. We're really great, our board of trustees are fab, and they've been encouraging us to do lots of wellbeing activities. So we've had one of our team members organise some hikes up and down the coast for us as part of, now we can meet up in groups of 6. We've been doing that, which have been lovely. So I think that will really help us sort of reintegrate as a team of people, really.
No, absolutely. And Vicky's has brought up the question of volunteers as well. Obviously, that's a key one as well. Reintegrating volunteers is going to be a challenge, and what volunteering might look like is really interesting. Well, I think we've got through lots of the questions, really. I can't see any more we kind of haven't really dealt with, unless anyone's got any others they want to ask directly. Maybe we could just, if not, should we finish up with just final thoughts from everyone about what they see the picture look like going forward? Are you optimistic, pessimistic? Maybe Philip, can we start with you?
Okay, my boundless optimism. I guess I need to be a little bit I guess I'm more cautiously optimistic these days, because I've had my first jab. I'm vaccination program is going really well. We're seeing confidence returning, but it's slow in what I've experienced. My experience of it is it seems quite slow. I've yet to go to a major gallery, although I know that, for example, in Bristol, the Royal West of England Academy has opened at step 2, because it's a charged show, it's a selling show, and they managed, and they're not a museum in that sense, so it's quite interesting. But as someone who's a museum fan and aficionado, the fact I've not been yet to a museum other than my own is interesting. But I'm kind of cautious myself, so I'm cautiously optimistic, and I think there is light at the end of the tunnel. But also we've been hit, we've been bashed back down into our boxes several times now. So we just have to hope that step 3 and the rest of the vaccination program goes smoothly, and that leads to us being able to re-engage with audiences and collections and museums. And we need people in there also to support the bottom line. We desperately need the support of visitors in our venues, as everyone knows. And I would say I know it has been very, very positive that the government has responded to the sector through the Cultural Recovery Fund, and I think that's, I missed some of the stuff earlier, but we benefited from that, and that's been a massive help. And things like the furlough scheme has been great. So let's just hope that this recovery process goes to plan, and we'll be in a happier place in a few months. Well, hopefully a couple of weeks, but also as it pans out. So yeah, cautiously optimistic that we're on our way to reopening and happy times.
Absolutely, I think I'd echo that's probably my view, the cautiously optimistic view. But it's difficult to take anything for granted after the past 12 months we've had. Sam, how about you? How are you feeling about the future?
Yeah, I think, well, firstly, to pick up on Phil's point now, I also think that the kind of government support has been really strong. And I think the sector, in terms of advocacy for the work that we do, that's been a great feature of the last 12 months. And we've also been able to benefit from CRF and lottery support as well. So that's been, I think that's been a real positive. And of course, there'll be another round CRF being launched soon. I am pretty optimistic, actually. I probably slightly not completely optimistic, but probably a little bit more than cautiously optimistic. I think in terms of audience and audience profile, my kind of view is that in the kind of early spring, we'll see some of our perhaps older visitors, like 50 plus visitors, actually come back in some force. And then hopefully, if the vaccination program continues to be successful, family audiences returning more fully in the summer. And obviously the focus on domestic tourism as well. For those of us in a kind of rural counties or coastal communities like Cornwall, that could potentially work well for the sector. But like Phil says, I really hope that this is a recovery which is here to stay, that we're not bounced back into further restrictions later in the year. So there is always that kind of view when we're thinking about the programme for next autumn and winter. You know, the kind of, you know, that consideration, the risk really that we could be having to live under the restrictions again, and of course we had to respond to that as a sector and individually. But I am optimistic. I've warned the site teams that they should be ready for a busy summer, and I really hope that that's the case for us all.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I'm going to be one of those domestic tourists in June. Somebody's birthday is going to be taking place in St Ives, so I'm heading down to Cornwall. So it seems a good point to end on you, Charlotte. How about you? How are you feeling about the future?
Yeah, I was going to go for optimistically optimistic, which I think might be the most optimistic of the panel, but who knows? Yeah, I am feeling good about things. Lots of my colleagues have and friends and family have had their vaccinations, and lots of the museum teams are heading towards that now. So it does feel like we're making progress. Absolutely right about domestic tourism. Cornwall is bracing for that this year, I think, in terms of what we're predicting. But that will have a really good, hopefully anyway, good economic impact on the museum sector, and will allow some of the smaller places and hopefully some of the volunteer-run museums that might not have had the luxury of accessing funds, you know, with teams and staff to deliver those sorts of things. They will be able to kind of have an influx of paid entry, coffees, and all of those sorts of things, which will really benefit them. I think if we can get through the summer here in Cornwall, that will make a big difference. Although similarly, a lot of the teams I'm talking to have kind of got 2 exhibitions planned for up to about October, and we're leaving it open, which feels quite strange for everybody involved, I think, but also quite exciting. And if we can, you know, retain some of that responsiveness and agility, then that's no real bad thing in my opinion. I know it puts a lot of pressure on people to do things quickly and turn things around, but hopefully it means we can remain really relevant and useful to the communities that we exist in. So yes, I am also optimistic.
That's a great point to end on, Charlotte. Thanks so much. And thanks for all of you. Thanks to Philip and Sam as well for joining us and speaking. It's been really interesting. We hope everyone else enjoyed this event. Another reminder, our next online event is on the 20th of May, and that's a one-day conference looking at how museums can become more inclusive. More details of that and everything else we do is on our website. And well, first and finally, thanks to all the speakers who spoke today, but also to the attendees. You've been fantastic. Thanks so much for coming and spending your time. Hopefully it was valuable and useful. I'm going off to vote now, so it's good fun there. And anyway, thanks so much, and we'll see you all again soon, maybe in person. So these members' meetings are annual events, so maybe next time we'll have a mix of in-person and hybrid and online, so everyone can come. But thanks to everyone.